up some of our food radicals and also tying it back into our conversation from this month about local food supply and the food supply chain. And so kind of in the 2 readings for this week that we have quite a few food radicals that are kind of giving us this different perspective on maybe what some of the challenges are in the food supply chain, but then also what are some of the ways we can tackle those challenges? What are some options to it? And so one of the first things that we open up with, and it's going to seem out of order, but I want us to start out with Bill Bullard just because it ties into how our conversation ended on Tuesday. We were talking about, the U.S. Packers legislation and how that's a law, but we don't really abide by it anymore. What was Bill's story behind that, and what is he working towards? What's the issue in the food supply chain?
That they're trying to, the beef industry is the last industry to conquer for the meat packers, and Bill's just fighting for the independent farmers and their rights. There's this organization called CAF or something.
RCAF.
RCAF, yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about that issue. Why does there seem to be tension between packers and producers in the beef industry?
Because the packers just want to control everything and have the most money and try to rip off the farmers as much as they can, like they've done with the pork and poultry.
There's a question that says that even the best of ranchers can no longer make enough money to stay in business. Does that suggest something's wrong with the food system? What do y'all think?
Without a doubt.
Yeah,
Why?
because the ranchers are the whole base. If we don't have them, then none of the stores will have anything.
If they can't make enough money to support themselves, they're not gonna wanna do it anymore either. And then,
Talk to me, what do y'all remember reading about Bill's kind of analysis of the issues from the 80s? About meat packers having more market power. What do y'all remember reading about that?
Well, the meat packers have bribed everyone, or both inspectors and politicians, to ignore all this stuff to get away with it. Is that what you're talking about?
Kind of, yeah. Talking about, we mentioned it a little bit last time, that there was just this push in the 80s. You can call it capitalism, you can call it neoliberalism, whichever one you want to go with. But just a push away from regulations as a whole. And so we saw a lot of consolidation start happening in the market, but we were trying to avoid. 1978, biggest 4 packers controlled about 30% of markets for steers and heifers. By 1994, the number was 82%. That's how much consolidation had happened. What does that mean? What are some of the implications of that?
It just leaves the farmers and ranchers at the mercy of a few large corporations.
Yeah. 4 packers. Who are those 4 packers?
I would say Cargill, right?
Uh-huh.
JBS.
JBS.
2 people you're interviewing.
Yeah. Oddly enough, Cargill is kind of they're changing their culture a little bit to kind of disperse. So that's why I'm leaning towards them, because they're kind of they seem to be we need to give more power to the farmers, otherwise the farmers aren't going to want to work regardless. That's kind of what they're realizing now. At least it's what they tell me, because I asked. But JBS, and there's Tyson's, and then who's the fourth one? Anybody? That one always slips my mind.
So interesting. Y'all should look into that and just see, why. And that's here in the U.S., but that's also, pretty consistent globally, because all of those companies are global companies, right? Where's JBS headquartered out of? In Brazil?
Yeah, I was going to say Brazil, somewhere in South America.
Yeah. So, interesting standpoint. What else stood out to y'all about Bill Bullard? What makes him radical? Why is he in this book?
It's like, it's not really him, it's like what is the organization and like how they're, like they won't give up, like they're set in their ways and like they're fighting for the independent farmer and they're not going to like give any leeway.
He also kind of brought up that, like, you'd think a lot of farmers are like, no, we don't want regulations, but he was one of the ones that was like, we need regulation because it's hurting the small people, like what we talked about Tuesday. Like, regulations seem bad until you're getting curb stomped because these large packers are just controlling everything.
Why do you think we've had such a climate of deregulation? Or like, it's that really, I mean, like what RCAP is doing, trying to say we need regulation is almost counter to the conversation we've been having in ag, at least since I've been alive, right? I was born in the 80s, right in the middle of this. Why is that such a hard conversation? What has been the narrative you feel like you've brought up being told as agriculturalists? What do we equate regulation with?
Control.
Government control, right? I mean, have any of y'all read some of this stuff and it's like kind of pushing at maybe some things you thought about before? I mean, what's been that process like for y'all, thinking through these issues?
I think thinking through some of these issues, it's always been just one-sided, because growing up, you just hear one side of the story, because you don't really have the information to think for yourself. And then after you start to see both sides, you can kind of balance out what you think.
Anybody had a shift in their thinking at all? Or where are you kind of lying right now when it comes to like things like regulation?
I think at first glance, at first thought, like you said, you might think, oh, regulation is like they're them trying to control us and they don't understand, but that's like kind of what the USDA is for and stuff, and like they're the Department of Agriculture, so they're supposed to understand and they're supposed to be making regulations to actually help. So I guess that could be it. I think that's a little bit of a shift for me in the change of thought. It's just like a lot of times, yeah, regulations don't help, but they're supposed to. They're not made to like make your life miserable.
That's not usually the intention.
Yeah.
I think, yeah. In some cases, yes, some cases, no, right? So there's a little more nuance to the purpose of it. What are some negatives of regulation? Specifically in agriculture.
They can have unintended consequences, like they can sometimes just make things just more expensive for farmers, just make it tougher on them.
I think it makes it very divided.
How so?
You have some people who are really for those regulations and think they could really benefit them, and then their neighbor could think the complete opposite, which means it could make it like a toll on like the relationship, but it's just a small scale.
Kind of like the origin of where it comes from and purpose. And yeah, sometimes there are unintended consequences. You hope people are thinking critically about these things, right? But then you kind of don't sometimes know the consequences, good or bad, until how far down the road. It could be 10, 20 years sometimes. Very rarely do we know immediate consequences. That's one thing with like economics and understanding markets, is that we have a tendency to look at things very short term, and so we'll enact a policy or enact a regulation, and then we'll want to critique it within 6 months, right? Anytime there's a change, there's always going to be a shock to a system. But you've got to give time to actually see what happens. You know, it's just like starting your own business. Are you going to make money right away? You might actually lose money. And so if you were to only make decisions off of your first 6 months of business, probably every business would go out of business, right? You'd be like, nope, this is a failed business, it's not going to work. But then what happens after 6 months?
Profit.
You start making profit. You start paying off some of your debt. Some of those behaviors start changing, what have you. And so you know, sometimes we have these unintended consequences. Sometimes we might determine them too early, or we just don't give ourselves enough time to actually see what happens 10, 15, 20 years down the road. What's another perhaps negative to regulations?
It could limit farmers' production and like how, what they wanna do, like, for example, just, the herbicides and pesticides and stuff in the waiting period, or like growth hormones and stuff like that. It might limit what farmers wanna do, but in the end, it's like for the better.
Yeah. So kind of initially you feel like you're limiting my freedom, right?
It's kind of like if it was only allowed to do like organic, then that might limit their production, because organic, you can't like make as much of it sometimes.
Right. So then on the flip side, what might be some supporting arguments for regulation? Like why might we need regulation from time to time?
Even playing field,
Also,
just that everyone's having to follow these rules and not, then somebody's not succeeding more than the other guy.
evens playing field makes competition, more equal competition. What else?
Safety.
Safety, yeah, so go back to Stephanie's example of like, sometimes we gotta do things we don't wanna do, but why might we need to have a regulation like that in place of when you can spray, when you can't?
Because if it's not, there's unintended consequences that are like, can cause cancer, or who knows, you know?
And it's like there's, sorry,
No, go
there's
ahead.
the withdrawal period on livestock if you give them any kind of medicine or antibiotics.
Yeah. There's legitimately health and environmental safety reasons for it, right? I think even about like pesticide application and the fact of, you know, not only is it when can you apply it, but certain licenses that you have to have for it. How many of y'all would, anybody in here have a pesticide applicator license? Or gone through that process? I don't know, it's a big deal back home because of all the produce that's given out. It's a week-long course, and most farmers are like, oh my gosh, I don't have a week of my life to go to the extension office and take this course, take this test to get my pesticide applicator's license. But just by having that, aside from any other regulations, what is that helping do? Do you think those farmers would learn the nuances of applying pesticide if they were required to get a license?
No.
Would y'all? Yeah. I feel like I'm just gonna go buy it. I'll read like the 2-line directions. Okay. So there is some educational component that sometimes regulations can provide. What else?
Didn't the guy in the Farm Bureau, head of Farm Bureau in the video say like the USDA or whatever not following the rules that were already in place is affecting like the farmers and whatnot? I don't remember what law that's in the books that isn't being followed or whatever. Do you-
So the Stockyard Act,
Yeah.
that is supposed to be limiting consolidation. It's on the books, but we just chose not to enforce it.
Yeah.
That's what led to that increased consolidation from 30% to 80%. Right? How does that happen? Anybody know? Does it make y'all think differently about government process at all sometimes, about like what is a law and does it really matter? A law's only as good as the law that's enforced.
I think it goes back to money. If you've got one guy big enough to have the money to say he can do it without these regulations, then so can everybody else.
I mean, yeah.
This might be a dumb question, but I don't know. What's the process of like certifying or whatever a regulation? Like, who's deciding that it should be a regulation?
It kind of depends. That's not a good answer. But it honestly does. It depends on if it's affecting, if it's something that's directly affecting constitutional change, that's when it's something that is voted on, oftentimes by House of Representatives and then the Senate. But then we have all these different agencies that work in the government. So like USDA is over all regulations that affect agriculture. And so oftentimes you have Senate and House committees that look at these different regulations to then provide a draft of it to then either approve. The committee kind of has like power to act for those regulations to go into effect to be enforced by those different agencies. Does that make sense? So that's why you'll see some regulations, it's like EPA decides to do whatever, or USDA decides to do whatever, and you're like, hold on, I didn't hear about this before. Oftentimes it came out of committee, went straight in there, like this is something that is more like the agency, the experts that work in that agency, they have the knowledge and expertise to decide and implement it, versus something that's going to be a constitutional change that truly needs to be voted on by our democratic republic. Does that make sense? That's why it's really important who serves in those agencies and whether they have the expertise to be there or not. That's a big thing, and a lot of times those are appointed type positions. So it's really important that the right people are in there so that they know what they're doing. Any other thoughts on regulations and just how that affects the food supply?
There was that one law, I don't know if it came out a couple years ago, that was where the livestock couldn't be transported without you having like a CDL or something. And it was like a really big thing back home because we were like, I don't know if I can take a trailer anywhere. And you had to have like specific reasons to be hauling livestock, and that was pretty interesting. Like I didn't get a chance to read too much into it, but I don't know if that's still a big thing anymore or not.
I haven't heard too much about that lately. Has anybody else?
Because I don't know how they would have enforced that unless they just pull over everyone's pulling a trailer.
Like checks, like weigh stations, but
Yeah.
you can go certain mileage, like this is really bad, but like I know a couple guys that are our age that just haul in the dead middle of the night and just go to point A to point B and hope for the best.
Yeah, regulations and laws are only as good as they can be enforced, right? And if there's actually some benefit behind it. So that's why, you know, sometimes there are things that are good ideas, but when you start getting to the practicality of it, you're like, there's just really no way to manage this, right? One of the conversations with, like, the mask mandate, I don't know if y'all saw, Stillwater Council voted yesterday to extend the mask mandate until to the end of February. Does Stillwater's mask mandate really make people wear masks? Why not?
It's unenforced. There's not a cop standing on every corner telling you to put it on, or in every restaurant to put it on.
All it does is ask people to put the sign. But there's no,
Depending on the business, like I've been in a few businesses where like I've seen them get on about people and like be like, hey sir, can I give you a mask? And be like, no. And she's like, well then I'm sorry, but can I ask you to leave? And like, it's kind of like.
it gives a little bit of weight to business owners
Yeah.
to have their own decisions in their business, but it's not really forcing anybody to do.
But like on the same scale, like if you're having to turn people away because they're stubborn, like they're losing business, so no one wants to do that either. So it's just like stupid. It's not stupid, but it just kind of sucks.
It's a lose-lose situation, but why do we follow it? Why do we do it?
Hopefully not get COVID.
Because, you know, we can kind of see data behind it and say it helps, right? And so maybe we can help influence behavior change. If y'all remember from Tech Change, what's the hardest behavior to try to get people to adopt?
Preventative.
Preventative measures, and they will always be, right? Preventative. After the fact, it's gonna be real easy to show people why things work, but while it's happening or beforehand, it's really hard for people to adopt those things. So, last thing that I thought was good that I just want to know y'all's thoughts on going with Bill Bullard is he talks about, again, kind of this idea of deregulation that occurred in the 80s, that there was this belief of what is good for corporations is good for the nation. What do you think about that? Do you think that's still what we think today?
No.
It's not what I think, but
Let's go with, Ethan said no first, and then we'll come to you, Briar.
All right.
Why'd you say no, Ethan?
I just kind of my thought on it. I can't really think of a reason right now. I think big businesses are only trying to get bigger, and I don't think that's what small, like local businesses need.
Yeah, but without those large corporations, you don't have large amount of jobs either.
small jobs in every town.
No, you don't. You don't have enough jobs in Stillwater to employ the entire community. People have to leave.
People would spread.
But would that give small companies a chance to step up, perhaps? I mean, theoretically.
I don't think they make enough profit to step up.
You don't think the whole country would equalize?
No, I
You
don't,
think there would still
unfortunately.
be
Well, I think
huge
there always
populous
has to be
areas?
big business, because small businesses won't thrive without big businesses, because you can't have a small business without everything else to buy stuff for your small business. Does that make sense?
They've also been put in a position where they can't though. So, I mean, I agree with you, like, we're at this point where it's hard to do a 180. But they've been put in this position where they can't thrive without the big business, so it's kind of like a, well, if we shut down the big business, there goes the small business, and then it's a mess.
Yeah, so this idea is about like regulations or laws being passed and who's benefiting. And he kind of said, it just seems like the thing was, well, we're gonna pass laws, we're gonna pass regulations that if it's good for corporations, then we've got to assume it's good for the nation or good for everybody. And so, do y'all agree with that? Do you think that's still the case today? Briar, you said no. What's your opinion on that?
Well, no, like, I think there is, like, it's all for big corporations and everything is in America is corrupt and a bunch of baloney, but, like, I don't know, I just don't like how the world's set up at all. I think it's stupid.
Amen.
Branching off of that,
I really want to know, because you made a face, I want to know what you're thinking.
I mean, everyone's entitled to an opinion, but I feel like it is a double-edged sword, like you were saying, because like we've sort of seen with the food deserts in those towns that don't have those big businesses and just have small businesses, they're not thriving, like there's food insecurity there. Like with big businesses, like it is allowing jobs, and I feel like
I also feel like with this pandemic, like, yes, people lost their jobs, but like also people were able to keep their jobs because large corporations were able to put them at a distance.
They're a necessary evil.
I think what y'all are getting at is maybe we've seen this pendulum swing, right, happen. And everything we've got to look at context, and it's not just like what's going on today. It's like what's the history. Let's load up here that we had small town America, small businesses. We swung in the 80s almost to this completely opposite. Do we want to swing back? Can we swing all the way back to the other side? No. It's a necessary evil, right? But do we want to stay where we're at? And how? Maybe not. We've got to find balance, right? We've got to find nuance. The answer is both. We need both.
Your question was like, didn't you say like, is it true that whatever's good for big corporations is good for America? No.
Like, should that be the only measuring stick for good decisions?
No. It should be like, you should be able to think about both. And if you can't, your brain is too one-sided.
Well, and if you're talking with someone about it and they're only thinking about one side, it's challenging others to have that conversation to think about all the different perspectives, to think about the unintended consequences that could happen, right? I love y'all because we can talk so much. And there was another point about Bill Bullard's criticism of ag colleges. I don't know if y'all remember reading that. Any thoughts on it?
I think it's true what he was complaining about, saying like how our colleges aren't teaching like the students to represent the independent farmer, but more just the companies. That's all they're teaching us to work for.
They kind of say, most states have a university with an ag econ department. Mind you, the author is an ag economics professor, so I think this is interesting that he writes it. Neoliberalism or capitalism is embraced in these departments also. And it's embraced because there's the economic belief right now that supply and demand, market competition is the way how markets should thrive, okay? So there's often in our departments rare objections to consolidation because we're saying, well, we're limiting consolidation, we're limiting competition. That's just how markets are working. But it says In some of the farming and ranching communities, they see this orientation as a betrayal of the land-grant mission of ag colleges. If ag colleges are supposed to help farmers, how can they not object to a system that may prompt a 90% fail in hog farms? What do y'all think about that? Do you think there's conflicting allegiances, I guess, in the things we do in ag colleges?
I mean, in our little report about Dan, it said, oh goodness, it says Dan's story illustrates the complex world of discovery in agriculture. On the one hand, genetic research is a public good and governments invest money in the research, expecting it to benefit society overall. On the other hand, private companies are investing money as well, and their goal is to make profits. And so there's the two different sides who are putting their resources into the colleges. And so we can't choose one side or the other, but you have to keep in mind both sides.
Yeah, both of them are happening. I don't know. Have y'all ever thought that? Have you ever sat in some of your classes and felt like, I don't know that this is really supporting what, I don't know. I remember sitting in some of my econ classes and being like, you just told me that we need to all go to comparative advantage and everybody needs to stop producing what they would have, and I was like, I don't know if I like that. It just seemed odd. But then I've also sat in animal science classes that I don't know that I necessarily agree with everything that was said there. I don't know. Does that happen to y'all at all? Maybe sit in my class, right?
Well, I'd say just because like I don't come from an ag background and literally this ag college is my entire agricultural experience. When I started in animal science, it was very much of like more of a corporate tone, kind of like we need to produce more to feed more, get into the mindset of like we need to be doing more. And then ag leadership kind of brought in this perspective of we need to have multiple levels of working systems at once instead of just one congruent effort to just push product out there. And it's just kind of a shift in mind frame. And it's like, I don't know if like, truly if my animal science friends got that other perspective. And it's just like, I don't know what their education looked like either. But like for me, my animal science side, it gave off that kind of perspective. But like, that's just my personal experience anyway. But
Any other opinions or experiences related to that?
I'm like non-ag background. Like the second I stepped foot on OSU, that was my ag. Like that's all I've known. So I think it's like higher education is a privilege for me because I've gotten all these different perspectives, literally not biased. Like going in, I just wanted to get into agriculture. I didn't have any of these preconceived ideas. So I think like while you don't agree with some of your professors, I think that's really important about our majors because we're learning these different perspectives. So, I mean, there's always going to be biases, but maybe that's because you're biased or the other hand.
Right. It's just whether we realize there are biases or not. Most people aren't even aware that they have them. So yeah, just talking about it makes it better and a more fruitful conversation. And so how does James Underwood try to tackle some of these issues in the supply chain with technology? What's his take on it?
We wrote down some things. So he was big technology, and so like how y'all were talking about, like you don't come from an ag background, like he mentions like you, or the book mentions like you don't need an agricultural background to improve the food system. And I almost think that like stepping in without any knowledge could be beneficial just because like you don't have any ties or like any loyalties anywhere. And so with him, like technology was designed, just kind of like a double-edged sword, like designed to make life a little easier, but it, at the same time as it was producing jobs, it was taking jobs away. And so it just goes back to like a double-edged sword. And then do you want this one?
Yeah. So he made different robots to help out farmers. So one of them was shrimp. And so shrimp would like basically de-stress cattle and everything, like dairy cows, and see if it would help their milk function and everything. And then also on top of it, if cattle were going into labor, it would notify the farmers so they wouldn't have to be out there knowing it. And it just went around. And then for fields and crops, he made a robot called Ladybird, and it would put pesticide on there, see like how it was growing, what it needed more of, what it needed less of, and went around and helped the farmers out.
Yeah. So I think I'll bring up this good point about just technologies in agriculture, and not, you know, we live in the world we live in today because we've had these technologies and these innovations that have made farming more efficient, more productive, so that we don't need as many people farming. And because of that, then people can go and get other jobs, and it's built the economy in those ways, right? It's kind of one of those, like, you tell people you want to go back to everybody farming, that's pretty nostalgic. And again, that pendulum swing, don't know that we can ever really go back there where we're at today, right? But we know that over the past 100 years, because of these technologies, jobs have been created and destroyed at the same rate because of technology. Is technology helping or hurting the food supply? What do y'all think?
I would say helping, especially in precision agriculture, where we have limited resources, and all these technologies are making it, I said that kind of funny, or all these technologies are making it easier to better regulate our resources we have.
I think for like regulations and like food safety technology really helps, but like for job and like job security, like the book says, like it's creating and destroying them at the exact same rate. So it's,
How is it doing that? How can you create and destroy at the same time?
Because like you have to have the mechanics for the robots, but you don't have to have the field workers anymore.
So we're seeing where the jobs are shift, right?
I think it's also helping bringing other people into agriculture, because it's taking these engineers who have no idea, but they know how the mechanics work on the different robots and different things. And so they're able to also play a part within the food industry.
yeah, the concept of like what we were talking about, like small and large corporations, I thought of like engineers. Like, unfortunately, engineers are not gonna be able to build a robot in a mom and pop shop downtown. Like, these technologies that we're using are unfortunately going to be provided by large corporations for individuals that maybe not wanna work there, but unfortunately don't have an option.
I think technology can also bring like unintended consequences too. It's like having to use gas to power them, and also you could have like an oil spill anytime, and just all that. You could have bad.
Absolutely. It's going back to our conversation with, you know, whether it's better to buy local or not. And it's like, really the concern isn't about transportation costs. It's about the carbon footprint on the farm. That more happens there because maybe we're implementing more equipment. That's a fair point, very fair point.
Well, no, I'm not trying to contradict what you say, but at the same time, like,
Conversation.
when like you're having people coming to like work in the farms, like that's gas, that's like multiple people, and you just have a machine that's able to go out and harvest, like that's one rather than 20. And so, I mean, none of us know the answers here, like that's just kind of what I think.
It also mentioned that the robots are more efficient because they can go through and spray the weeds instead of having to spray a whole
And
field.
like, it talked
So
about
it's
how
a
they could
lot
like
less.
pool them individually rather than just having to spray entirely. So,
I think it's helping with more production of ag products, but maybe less jobs, like you said. So hurting individual people losing their jobs, but production-wise, like you can do a lot more with a combine or with a tractor than you can with horses. Trust me, I do it in the summer. I know how long it takes.
You know, it's not really discussed in this a lot. You know, they don't really mention human behavior a lot, and that's what we study in Agle, is we study a lot of human behavior. Do you think we're just really bad at adapting to change?
I know I am,
For sure.
I can admit that.
I think it's human nature to stay the same.
Like, I don't like when my mom moves furniture when I go home. Like, it's very unhealthy for me.
My mom will FaceTime you before she moves anything in the house.
Yeah, I just think about like the interesting paradox that happens in ag, and y'all comment on this and say, you know, maybe it's just the people I've been around. we tend to be, and we talked about this way back the first week of class when we talked about maybe some of our biases in ag. I know, let's go way back. We said, in ag, we love innovation. We love new technologies. We tout them. But then what happens if it changes how we have to do things? How do we tend to react? We oppose it, right?
It depends, if it's like, if it's something we can just, like, all we gotta do is click a button and watch it go, then it's like, hey, that's nice. But then if it's something we gotta do so many more steps, and it's like, we don't wanna do that, let's just do it our own way.
Well, it's one of, again, it's like, okay, I can implement this new technology because I want to have more production. But it may make me have to fire 2 people that work for me because I don't need them working for me anymore. And then we complain that not enough people work in ag. Do you see this like circle we get ourselves on? It's kind of frustrating. And it's like, I don't know how to get out of the hamster wheel.
It's almost like we're creating more, like with the technology industry, we're creating more jobs outside of the ag industry. So like people that are working on these technologies aren't kids with ag businesses degree, they're aerospace mechanical engineers.
So then why do we demonize them if we're the reason they're not working on the farm?
Because we're insecure.
I don't know. You're asking very hypothetical questions. I don't know the answer.
That could be part of the reason why there's such a demand for higher education too, because instead of like not having higher education, you need a better job to be more educated on working with this better technology. It's not like you can go get a job anywhere and work on paper.
Why, again, you think about this, our industry has caused a lot of people, it may not have happened right in our generation, but generations before, to change their occupations, to change their careers. Because of the things because of the innovation that we've had in agriculture and the new technologies. And so why, are there any areas of change do you think that we are less likely to adopt right now just because we're afraid of change and we're afraid it may make us have to change what we do in our occupation? Like we put that burden on other people generations ago by adopting, but now that it's our turn to adopt some new things that may change, we don't want to do it. What do y'all think?
I think our generation, the younger people are more likely to agree with the change and go with it. Like, I know like everyone deals with having a hard time with change, but I feel like just younger people are a lot easier at going with it.
This is a topic in my class. We're talking about like the younger generation and how we will mesh with, how Gen Z will mesh with Gen X, is that correct? Like the article we read was talking about how like our generation is way more adaptable because like we've seen the global pandemic, we've seen an economy crash. We may not remember like 9/11, but we were alive. And so like our generation has continually had to adapt. Like we're the last generation to like played outside, but also grow up with technology. And so I think our generation will be like the first like eager ones to try something a little different than it has been done before.
I mean, I remember my parents before we had the home phone, and then they had flip phones, and then it just progressed to, I remember my mom getting her first touch screen and the Blackberries when they came out. So I think we've adapted so well to the new technologies that it's just part of who we are.
Yeah, and I also think our generation gets a really bad rap because we are really invested in technology because that's like what we've known. And I'm not saying it's a positive at all as my phone sits on my desk. But I think with like us having the ability to grow up like that, we also know that it's okay and that like what we're doing is beneficial, and it just doesn't always, it's not always perceived like that from older generations.
Again, I don't know the right answer to this, but just thinking about the shifts we've seen in agriculture, the changes we've seen in our industry because of technologies and having to adapt to new technologies. One industry that's really being, I don't say targeted, but highlighted right now with like how they're adapting is the energy industry, right? Oil. How do y'all feel like they may be kind of pressed in with these new innovations, and what's their adaptability looking like? If you feel like they're going with the flow and adapting? Why do you feel that way, or why do you think they're challenging having to change and adapt? What's driving that human behavior?
Money. More people make more money when they're all out there working rather than they just have some kind of innovation out there where just like the people that own that or have the ability to own the technology are.
And you hear a lot of the conversation about pushing to clean energy or wind energy or natural gas. You know, if you're from a mining community in Appalachia, what are you worried about there with that? I mean, again, it's weird to think about. Like, we had this happen in agriculture, and now we're seeing it happen in other industries. How are they reacting? And if we had another big change like that, how would we react right now?
It's just so expensive to change sometimes. Like get a new tractor that's electric, or you know, like even trying to have solar energy in your home is expensive. Or sometimes I think people don't want to change because it's so expensive.
That initial upfront cost, right?
Because the innovation companies can charge so much because it's this new thing.
Are there any ways that we try to lessen that cost for people? I think this is fascinating. So like in some states, like the solar energy to power your homes, like some states have incentives where like they'll do cost share. Okay, if you're willing to adopt this new technology, we'll pay for half of it. It's a form of a subsidy, essentially. Or you can have the option that once you, like if you have solar panels and you gather enough energy beyond what you use in your household, you can sell it back to the grid. So you can actually make money off of it. Like that's what happens in California. Same thing with electric vehicles. You might get a rebate if you purchase an electric vehicle, or a tax break in the year that you purchase it. I don't know if this is still true, but a couple of years ago, Oklahoma was the only state that could actually, like, you could actually be charged more taxes if you purchased an electric vehicle. Why would they do that? Try to support the oil industry. Yeah. Yeah.
We're also not willing to, you know, put electric chargers in any.
Burleson did?
No, I said we're not willing,
Like Oklahoma.
Oklahoma in general.
Yeah. Have y'all seen them in Stillwater?
There's one
There-
at that park.
there's one at the electric
behind
co-op.
CVS.
Yeah. Boomer has some.
Central Electric has some.
But I've yet to see a whole lot of electric vehicles. I'm like, way to go town. But then I don't know who's using them yet. So along these same lines of the food system, we have Aero Farms. So, and kind of with this, Aero Farms and what they're doing with vertical gardens, as well as like our technology on the same point of GMOs, what are they trying to do to help improve the food system, or what do they think the issues are?
Lack of resources. Like the whole reason they started it was for water conservation, and now they're not even growing plants with soil either, and that's another big one that's just a limiting factor in farming.
Yeah. So if the issue's lack of resources, how can we figure out how to grow without them? How's that tie into genetically modified or plant breeding?
So there's this one line, it says, harnessing this natural process makes it possible for production of a healthier soybean oil without it being a GMO. And so the genetic engineering, they were talking about turning on or turning off specific genes. And since you're not inserting or taking it out, it's not considered a genetically modified organism. So consumers are more apt to buy it because it's not a GMO.
Basically, like, these GMOs and different breeders and stuff are trying to help the farmer. They're trying to allow the farmer to have different diversified crops, even if they're not GMOs, when they're taking out just the in and out the different genetics and not replacing with another that's just naturally grown. They're trying to help the farmer when, like, let's say traditionally grown, like soybeans or corn, like the market crashes or like taken out by diseases or whatnot. They're allowing these variety crops to be there and allow the farmer to have them to supplement their income. So
It also says gene editing makes it easier to plant different varieties of the same crop in different regions of the world. And so, I think it said Minnesota was where, Evan was from. He's able to grow other crops besides just corn and soybeans now, because they're more, susceptible to the weather there.
I think it's interesting, one of the big things that their stories point out and what the, kind of them talking about their motivation for why they do the things they do, is almost the motivation is the same between those who are plant breeders creating GMO crops, if you want to think they're bad, as well as organic producers, right? What are they both motivated to try to do? Preserve the environment, decrease the use of natural resources that are going away, right? I like this point that they say, Evan says, talking about the GMO debate. I think all too often it's just two sides shouting at each other, unwilling to listen to the other side. But what we find is that the nice thing about pursuing the same goal through different means is that it increases the odds that one of them will work. What do y'all think about that? Can we pursue things completely different and yet still have the same motivation for what we're doing?
Just what do you hold like as a core belief,
Any examples beyond just the GMO organic debate of where people probably have the same motivation but maybe are going about it two different ways? Is there different ways?
Like ending hunger, the hunger approach and the poverty approach.
Yeah. And I feel like what